The following presentation was made at Southern Evangelical Seminary's 2011 National Conference on Christian Apologetics in Charlotte, North Carolina. Find out more about Christian apologetics or to hear more great talks, go to ses.edu.
Of Christianity, and the two basic questions that usually pop into people's minds when they see the title of the talk. First, is he actually going to argue that Christianity somehow owes a debt to the Mithraic cult? And the second question that usually comes to mind is, what on earth is the Mithraic cult? Because generally I would assume most people have not heard of Mithraism, or if you have heard of it, you may not know a whole lot about it. But by the end of the presentation, I hope that you will actually know a good deal about it, maybe more than you want to know. And like I said, I'm going to talk very quickly, so if I lose anybody, I apologize up front. You could always pick up the recording and try to hear what you missed, because it's very difficult to get this talk into a 50-minute time frame, so I'm just going to move rather quickly. First, we want to talk about the major problem, which is the issue of Christian borrowing. We want to know, to what extent is Christianity actually indebted to the cult of Mithras? I may use interchangeable terms, the cult of Mithras, Mithraism, Mithraic cult. That all refers to the same thing. What you see over here are two illustrations, two visuals. Here's a picture of a Mithraic initiate from the Dea Europa Mithraeum in Syria, and here is a Greco-Roman version of the seated Christ. This type of parallel is not what I'm going to be talking about. This is simply an artistic parallel. But a lot of people jump on artistic parallels to try to prove some kind of dependence between Christianity and earlier paganism. But the actual parallels that we're concerned with are a little bit more substantial. There's several accusations. First, that Mithraism and Christianity actually exhibit parallels in myth, ritual, and message. Second, that Mithraism predates Christianity. And the third, that Christianity has borrowed actually from Mithraism. Now, first we're going to deal with the issue of dependence and chronology. If Christianity actually has dependence on Mithraism, then Mithraism must predate Christianity. Of course, if Mithraism does predate Christianity, it does not guarantee that there is some kind of borrowing. It doesn't constitute proof of dependence. However, if Mithraism does not predate Christianity, then of course Christianity could not have borrowed from it. So we're going to first investigate the issue of whether or not Mithraism comes before Christianity chronologically. But there's other necessary conditions. If Mithraism does predate Christianity, we want to show that not only does it have prior existence, but we also would need to prove that their adherents, the adherents of Christianity and Mithraism, have actually had some kind of contact. That the stories, rituals, and beliefs of the two sects actually have what we call real and significant parallels, not just general cursory similarities, because those won't prove anything. That there's really no better candidate to understand nascent Christianity than Mithraism, and that there is some kind of oral or literary dependence of the latter upon the former. Okay, so those are all in addition to chronological priority. First, I want to talk about the mystery cults, because Mithraism actually is grouped with what's called a mystery cult, an ancient mystery religion. And a mystery cult, if you haven't heard of it, is really an example of a phenomenon that we see in world religions that you could find all over the place. Movements away from a traditional, impersonal type of devotion or religious activity towards a more personal, intimate approach to a deity, or at least attempting a more intimate approach towards religion. So we see this phenomenon in Islam with the Sufi movement, we see it in Buddhism, we see it in Hinduism, and we also saw it in early Greco-Roman religion. So the mystery cults of the Greco-Roman world, which originated probably as early as the 7th century BC, were a form of personal religion that was different from the traditional state cult, which demanded certain things as far as your action goes to show that you are a member of society, but didn't really ask much of you as far as your belief system. Okay, what you believe at home is irrelevant to the cult activity that you engage in as a member of society. So mystery religions are different. You don't have to participate. This is purely voluntary. They do shoot for some type of union with the divine, some type of intimacy with a deity of some sort. And the main focus of the cult, or most of these cults, is through an initiation ceremony where there's often some kind of secret information given to you, not necessarily a teaching, but the revelation of some secret truth, maybe a sacred object. And then the people are sworn to secrecy, to maintain the secret, which is one of the reasons we don't have a whole lot of information on any particular mystery cult, because the people took the vow of secrecy fairly seriously. The idea of an initiation and vow of secrecy actually constitutes this group identity that members of the cult have with one another. So not all the cults actually ended up with a community, okay, where you meet on a regular basis with other members. You could do this maybe once and then go back to your normal life, but you're still bound by this basic identity through this vow of secrecy. One of the major themes for most of the mystery religions has to do with the seasonal cycle, the natural cycle of death and rebirth of nature. There's often a promise of salvation, but what we mean by the term salvation is not necessarily the Christian understanding of a eternal life or forgiveness of sins or anything like that. Salvation could be as general as some type of temporary blessing. It could be healing from sickness. It could be from any number of things. And generally, most of these cults lack doctrine. That's not true of all of them. The Orphic cult, the Pythagoreans, there are various cults that actually had belief system or teachings, but most of them did not. Okay? Christianity is often grouped with mystery cults, but there are some distinctives, and I may mention that as we go. So let's turn to Mithraism itself. What are the parallels that are commonly expounded by modern critics? First, let's look at the story. The general story that is talked about popularly about Mithras is that he was born of a virgin. He was born in a cave. He was born on December 25th. His birth was witnessed by 3 shepherds. 3 Persian magi brought gifts to him as an infant. He's accompanied by 12 companions or disciples. When he was later ministering publicly, he raised the dead, healed the blind, expelled demons. He held the keys of the kingdom. He died and was resurrected. And he celebrated a Last Supper with his companions before he ascended into the heavens. So if his story sounds familiar, it just means you've read the Gospels. And this is a challenge I think Christians need to be able to deal with and answer. Also, we have parallels in ritual and tradition. Baptism ritual, the initiation of Mithraic initiates usually went through some kind of water baptism, whatever that means. The accusation that there was a Lord's Supper or a communal meal shared by various initiates. Also, you have the more regular observances like the Sabbath observance, which would have been gathering together as a community on the Sunday, the day of the sun, and the annual observance of the birth of Mithras on December 25th, and also a observation of the resurrection and ascension at the time of the spring equinox, which would coincide with Christian celebration of Easter. So we're going to talk about all these. I'm going to start first again with the dating issue, which I mentioned. Can we distinguish the Mithraic cult from earlier Mithra worship? Because there's actually no debate about the antiquity of the god known as Mithra. But we want to know, is Mithraism, the Greco-Roman cult, a direct outgrowth of the earlier Mithra worship, and does this later cultic form actually predate Christianity? We'll start by looking at its antiquity. The earliest references to Mithra as a god actually come in the Hittite culture, in Hittite writings. And he's basically an Indo-Aryan deity, and some people put his origin at least as the 3rd millennium BC, so this obviously predates Christianity. The Hittites, which I have on the map here, is show you the extent of the Hittite Empire at its height, which was in central Anatolia, which is modern Turkey, with the capital being at Hattusa. The actual earliest writing mentioning the name Mithra comes from the 14th century BC, from a treaty between King Suppiluliuma of the Hittites and the Mitanni king Matuwaza, who Mitanni are located in northern Mesopotamia. So we have, again, the names show up very early in history. In India, we have the word Mitra, a little bit of a different pronunciation than Mithra, Mithraism. And he was part of a triad of gods, Mitra, Varuna, and Indra being 3 of the key deities. And we see them in the Rig Veda, which are the earliest of the Vedic scriptures, which would date back to a time between 1500 and 1000 BC. And we see over and over again this conjoined form of the names Mitra, Varuna, which seems to indicate the real importance of the god Mitra, since Varuna was one of the supreme deities in the religion. He's basically a sun god type of a figure, but he's not necessarily a personification of the sun. His main focus is on his ethical nature, because his name doesn't refer to the sun as much as it refers to this issue of covenant and contract. So he was a god of treaties, which is one of the reasons we see him show up in the Hittite treaty. In Persia, we see the name Mithra-Ahura show up in Persian writings, which again is a cognate of the Mitra Varuna that we see in the Vedas. The Persian god Ahura Mazda, who becomes most familiar in the Zoroastrian tradition, was worshipped prior to Zoroastrianism. Some suggest under the name of Varuna. Some simply think he was referred to as Ahura, the great Ahura. And again, the conjuncted form of the name again indicates that even within Persia, Mitra, or Mithra here, was second in the pantheon as the most important deity. But eventually there's actually the picture, I should point out what it is. It's the ascension of the king Ardashir. It's this Sasanian period Persian relief sculpture. In the middle you see Ahura Mazda, and behind him you see the figure of Mithra with the rays of the sun sort of coming out of his crown. Later, when Zoroastrianism emerged, which would have been around 600 BC, we do not see the name Mithra in the earliest Zoroastrian texts, which are the Gathas, the hymns that are attributed to Zarathustra himself. But we do see his name appear in later Avestan texts as the second only to the wise Lord. In a work called the Yasht, in Yasht 10, which is from the 5th century, it says, Ahura Mazda said to Zarathustra to Spitamid, when I created Mithra of the wide pastures, I made him, O Spitamid, as worthy of worship and praise as myself, which shows you the lofty position of the god Mithra in the tradition. Additionally, the descriptions of him in the Avesta coincide with what we see in the Vedas of India. He resides in this great palace. He commands a team of immortal horses that pulls the chariot of the sun. He again is still associated with the sun, but he is not personified as the sun, and he's a judge of the dead. But his primary epithet, his most common title, is Lord of the Wide Pastures. And he's not a deity in Zoroastrianism, because Zoroastrianism is essentially a monotheistic religion, and more of a dualism, but he's part of a group of beings known as the Azata, which are sort of spirits worthy of worship, and they are basically akin to the angels that we find in Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, the spread of the Greco-Roman cult, we're going to look at the earliest references to the Persian god among Greek and Latin writers. And the earliest reference we have in that world is from Herodotus, the father of history. And when he talks about Mithra, he refers to him as a goddess who is similar to the goddess Aphrodite. So clearly in the 5th century BC, the Greeks weren't very familiar with the god, okay, or he would have not have made such a careless mistake. And he's actually from Asia Minor, so he's not from the Greek mainland, or actually closer to, the east. Strabo actually equates Mithras. You'll sometimes see the S on the end of the name now, which is going to be common in the Roman world. Associates him with the god Helios, or the sun god. Plutarch calls him a mediator between the darkness and the light. And Quintus Rufus, who is writing about the time of Alexander the Great, actually talks about the Persian king in the 4th century BC actually passed around the ranks of armed men praying to the sun and Mithra and the sacred eternal fire. So he again knows the association between the sun and this particular god. Now, as far as the Roman cult goes, I'm going to make an argument that the Roman cult has its origins no later than the late 1st century AD, and most significantly through the 6th and 4th centuries AD when it really spreads. And its form in the West is very different than anything we see in the East. It's a cult that's only open to men, is incredibly popular with the Roman soldiers, formed a type of a secret society that did meet on a regular basis and did have certain teachings associated with it. And it actually had an ethical slant, unlike a lot of the mystery cults. And the ethical slant tended to be an emphasis on the issue or virtue of duty, which would be obviously popular with the soldiers. And of course, they had a permanent brotherhood more common than you find in other religions, as I already mentioned. There are a number of emperors that are actually cited as initiates into the Mithraic cult. The earliest and a questionable initiate is the Emperor Nero in the mid-1st century AD. Commodus, we know, is a known participant in the late 2nd century. I think the picture of him over here is a little different than, if you're familiar with Commodus, it's probably from the movie Gladiator. It doesn't look anything like Joaquin Phoenix up there. But Septimus Severus and Caracalla, father and son, late 2nd, early 3rd century were initiates. And then the Tetrarchs, Diocletian, Constantius Chlorus, Galerius, and Maximian were known initiates in the early 4th century, right prior to the legalization of Christianity in the Roman Empire. We're going to talk about Nero a little bit later. Now, as far as Roman Mithras association with the sun goes, he was associated with the sun in the Mithraic cult, but he's always distinct from the sun. So in various illustrations, you always see the god Mithra pictured next to the god Sol or Helios. And you can always identify Mithra by the little Persian cap, which makes him look a little bit like a dwarf, but it's sort of cute. So again, he's not a personification of the sun, but he is associated with it, even here. The Emperor Elagabalus in the early 3rd century attempted to move the Roman religion towards a worship of the sun god almost exclusively. It was sort of a henotheistic movement that he was attempting. He brought the Syrian sun god El-Gabal to Rome and worshipped him as Deus Sol Invictus, which means the unconquerable sun god. By the end of the century, the Emperor Aurelian makes the sun cult an official cult of the Roman state, and so in which this becomes very popular. And of course, Mithras, being associated with the sun god, ends up having this additional title added to him, Unconquerable Sun. So we're going to see the term, the Unconquered One, apply to the god Mithras himself. Now, as far as Mithraic studies have gone, ever since the late 1800s, the dominant school of thought has been influenced by Franz Cumont, who was a scholar on Mithraism. And he basically saw the Roman cult having its origins in Zoroastrianism. And he believed that since Mithras originated in Persian Mithra, the cult likewise originated in the Eastern Roman provinces. And he believes that the Romans adopted the god of their enemies when the Romans were starting to conscript soldiers from the regions of Anatolia, Pontus, Cappadocia, Comagony, and places like that. There are three main pieces of evidence that he points out. There's a belief among the Roman writers and the church fathers that the cult was of Persian origin. Okay, I'll show you quotes to that extent. The ancient Persian Mithra was an Indo-Aryan deity, and there are the use of several Iranian words in the Roman mysteries. So he believed this was all proof that it originated in Zoroastrianism. Now, the supposed transmission was that the Roman Mithraic cult emerged in Zoroastrianism as it was imported to Anatolia by the Magi, or the priestly caste within Persia. The proof of post-Zoroastrian worship was indicated by the fact that you have a number of kings in that region named Mithridates, literally the gift of Mithras. Okay, now Cumont believed this is proof of the cult's popularity centuries before Christian era. So he's the one that suggests the chronology that places Mithraism prior to Christianity, which we have to deal with. The evidence, this is the most devastating or most helpful piece of evidence for Cumont's theory, is from Plutarch in his Life of Pompey. Here Plutarch's writing at the late 1st century, early 2nd century A.D. And in his account of the Life of Pompey, he talks about the Cilician pirates who he defeats. Pompey was a Roman general around 65 B.C. And what he did is he settled them in Greece. And he says they offered, the Cilicians, offered strange sacrifices of their own at Olympus and celebrated their certain secret rites among which those of Mithras continue to the present time, having been first instituted by them. Okay, so Pompey's quote makes it seem like the cult existed in the 1st century BC prior to Christianity. So we're going to need to talk about that quote in a little bit. Julius Firmicus Maternus, 4th century A.D., says, "To him they gave the name Mithras and celebrated his rites in secret caves. When you affirm, therefore, that the temples and Magian rites are duly performed after the Persian ceremonial, why do you confine your approval to these Persian rites alone if you think it not derogatory to the Roman name to adopt Persian cults and Persian laws?" So here's the common belief that these mysteries are Persian in origin. Now, there's a number of disagreements by modern scholars with Cumont. Ever since the early Mithraic conferences, people have started to question the relationship between the Roman god Mithras and the Persian Mithra. The Roman mystery Mithras is different from Mithra as found in the Avesta. He is a salvific figure in the mystery cult where he was not a salvific figure in the Persian tradition. There's no evidence that Mithra ever had his own cult within Persian Zoroastrianism. And a very important scholar of Iranian religion, R.C. Zeiner, actually says that there is a great difference between the Roman mysteries and, quote, any form of Iranian religion we know of from the original sources. So we can't really find a really substantial predecessor to Roman Mithraism in the regions that we've been looking for it in. The extent that Asiatic kings bearing the name Mithridates actually may be less useful than establishing an early date as once thought. This is called a theophoric name, obviously a name that bears the name of a god. It's really no indication of the bearer's actual religious beliefs. It's almost like somebody today being named Christopher, and you assume he must be a Christian missionary of some sort. But, of course, that doesn't really show anything about the person's particular beliefs, and it would be the same back then. All inscriptions that we found from the region of these kings simply shows Mithras as one god among a larger pantheon. It doesn't really stand out in any particular way. There's no indication of a mystery cult attached to his religion, and there's no evidence of Zoroastrian worship anywhere in the East that employs the iconography that we're going to notice in the Roman cult. And I'll talk about iconography in a little bit. Now, what do we do with Plutarch's account? Plutarch, again, gave us the account of the settling of the Cilician pirates in Greece. And we do know where they were settled. They were settled in a region known as Dyme, which is in Achaia, in northern Peloponnesus, right, in that region there. This particular passage is not as powerful as it would seem based on a couple factors. First of all, Pompey is writing about a century and a half after the events occurred. And a lot of scholars have suggested that Pompey may be confusing the mystery cult during his own time with maybe some earlier form of Mithra worship that may have been going on. Because we find no evidence of the Mithraic activities in these regions, which scholars think should show up if that's actually what was imported at the time. Okay, so Plutarch really doesn't establish what Cumont thought it established. Basically, since the first International Congress of Mithraic Studies, scholars have begun to question whether or not Mithraic cult is a new religion in the Roman Empire that had been simply created by employing a Persian god simply to bring out some kind of exotic appeal. There have been two basic conferences, in 71 and then in 75. Scholars have basically rejected all the key elements of the Cumont hypothesis. And when that hypothesis goes, the chronology basically goes with it. So we now have to talk about what exactly is the date that we could say for Mithraism. And the key evidence is going to be supported by literary and archaeological pieces. As far as literary evidence goes, we don't have a whole lot. There's no texts from within the cult that have survived, and there's very few literary references outside the cult. But as far as archaeological evidence goes, we've got a ton. We've got Mithraic temples, inscriptions, we've got plenty of relief sculpture and other kinds of art that go as well. So let's first look at the literary pieces. Dio Cassius, who is a Roman historian and senator in the 3rd century A.D., does talk about a king known as Tiridates visiting the court of Nero in 66 A.D. And he says Tiridates addressed Nero this way: "And I have come to thee, my God, to worship thee as I do Mithras." So obviously he was a worshiper of Mithras. Pliny, who's writing as a contemporary of the event, says that the Magi, or suggested Magi, have actually initiated Nero into their banquets. And then Statius, who's writing also around the same time, seems to be aware of a part of the Mithraic myth that talks about beneath the rocky Persian caves, straining at the reluctant following horns. And I'll tell you what that refers to later. But these are, again, key pieces that seem to show that Mithras was coming into Rome, at least in the mid-1st century. Well, what do we make of these passages? Well, as far as Dio Cassius and Pliny go, it's not clear that this guy Tiridates was anything more than a normal worshiper of Mithras. Doesn't mean he was an initiate into a Mithraic cult of any sort. There's no basis for determining the nature of the rites that they initiated Nero into, which is why I said we don't know if he was really an initiate into the cult. Okay? The Magi were supposedly the ones that initiated Nero into something, but the text actually has a very vague linguistic sense. The word magikis in Latin could refer to a banquet of the Magi, or it could refer simply to magical banquet. So we don't even know what he was talking about. And in fact, the passage in Pliny is talking about magic in the Roman Empire. So we may not be talking about magi at all. But we also know that if the Magi were priests, this doesn't fit what we know about Mithraism, because Roman Mithraism didn't have a clergy. So this obviously is not Mithraism that Nero was involved with. As far as Statius goes, I'm not going to spend as much time here, but it does seem to show a knowledge of the key myth or the key part of the story. But there's some debate as to what kind of date this actually establishes. Some people think if he is referring to the Mithraic story, then the Mithraic cult may date between 69 and 96 A.D. If it's sort of referring to something other than that, they'll push the date back to the early 2nd century, around the time of Hadrian. Okay, so again, we still haven't established a date earlier than the late 1st century, either way we go. As far as archaeological evidence goes, Mithraeum is a Mithraic temple. This is the key element and place where people would worship as Mithraic initiates. And in the city of Ostia, which is the port of Rome itself, this is the most important seaport in the Roman Empire, there are over 14 excavated temples, all dating between 150 and 260 A.D. And there's a complete absence of these temples throughout the empire prior to 140 A.D. So we're talking 2nd century for all of these remains. And due to the central importance of the Mithraic structure, scholars don't really believe that there could be a developed form of Mithraism existing prior to that structure. It's not like Christians worshiping in a church. We know Christians worshipped in homes, but it doesn't seem to be the case that Mithraic initiates ever did such a thing. There have been very few Mithraea that have been found in the regions nearest to Persia, such as Mesopotamia. Palestine in particular is important in Asia Minor, where Cumont says it originated. There's no Mithraic monuments at all found in Persia, which again goes contrary to Cumont's hypothesis that it was from Iran that this thing eventually spread. As far as the Mithraea in the rest of the empire go, majority of sites are in the west, primarily in Italy, Italy, Germany, and the Balkans is where the brunt of these things are found. There's actually only 4 Mithraic monuments found in Asia Minor, and all of them date after 150 A.D. The earliest archaeological evidence we do have actually comes from Hungary at a place called Carnuntum, and as early as 72 is the earliest possible date for these particular pieces of information. And it was at a military base by the 15th Legion that was stationed there. And this particular legion of the Roman Empire did spend time in the east, fighting the Parthians around 63 A.D., almost said B.C., and they also participated in the revolt of the Jews, in the Jewish War in 66 to 70. Some people think that they're the ones that brought the cult into Europe for the first time, but we still don't know where they got it from, if they did pick it up. Some people have actually suggested that the people they did come in contact with were not Mithraic initiates, but Jews and Christians, and may have taken Christian ideas and sort of brought them back to Europe and mingled them with some kind of Mithraic idea and originated the idea there. But that's just speculation. We don't know where they would have picked it up. The earliest inscription that we have, actually early 2nd century. So basically, in conclusion, taking into consideration all the Mithraic remains throughout the entire Roman Empire and beyond, scholars have actually failed to identify any material dating prior to the late 1st century A.D., which doesn't give us the date that we need to say it precedes Christianity. Now, as far as other problems for the issue of theft, Mithraism is basically eluded detection in every area in which it must have existed if it was going to have influence on Christianity. And in spite of the god Mithras' long history, there's no evidence of a Mithraic mysteries prior to the advent of Christianity. To sort of, again, sum up the evidence at this point, very little material has been found linking Mithraic rites to the region that birthed Christianity. Because remember I said, not only do we have to have it predate Christianity, we actually have to have it exist in a region that would influence the early Christians, which would have been Judea and Palestine. So evidence of Mithraism is lacking throughout most of the eastern provinces. You do have scarce remains in Palestine and Syria. Only 6 known sites in those particular regions, most of them in Syria. And the earliest of these falls in the 2nd century, again, well after the Christian New Testament was written. All the evidence unearthed in Syria happens to show signs of Roman iconography, not Eastern iconography. And the only Mithraeum that's ever been found in Palestine wasn't even built until the 4th century. So we're talking several centuries after Christianity when it was in that particular region. And the evidence in the Western Empire really doesn't help at all. Now at this point, I think you might be saying, if you're familiar enough with logical arguments, you may be saying, I'm making a fallacious argument to ignorance. That I'm saying that because I don't find any evidence for Mithraism, therefore it could not have existed prior to Christianity. And it may sound like I'm saying that, but I realize that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I don't know exactly how it proved the non-existence of the cult. But what the issue is that I'm trying to bring up is the burden of proof really isn't on me to prove it didn't exist. The burden of proof is on those that try to say Mithraism did exist prior to Christianity. And what I've been trying to do is show you that every piece of evidence that they use fails when we examine it carefully. So I don't think they proved their case, and I don't think Mithraism actually existed prior to the early or late 1st century. But to be generous, let's assume that it did. I'm not saying it did. Let's just assume that it does predate Christianity. We still have other things to deal with, like the parallels. So let's reconstruct the story of Mithras. There was a myth. We know that. We don't have good evidence of what the story was in its complete form because they didn't leave us any texts. So we're going to piece together what we can from the Church Fathers and other sources. So let's deal with the issue of the virgin birth. Justin Martyr, writing in the early 2nd century, says this about the birth of Mithras. Those who record the mysteries of Mithras say that he was begotten of a rock, and call the place where those who believe in him are initiated a cave. And when I hear Trypho, said I, that Perseus was begotten of a virgin, I understand the deceiving serpent counterfeited this also. Now he does mention a virgin birth with Perseus, but when it comes to Mithras, he simply says he was born from a rock, which is not exactly the same thing. Looking at some other texts, Commodian in the 3rd century says this. He says, the unconquered one was born from a rock, if he is regarded as a god. Moreover, you still depict him also as a thief, though if he were a god, he certainly did not live by theft. Surely he was of the earth and of a monstrous nature, and he turned other people's oxen into caves, just as did Cacus, the son of Vulcan. So again, the same idea. Jerome, late 4th, early 5th centuries, writes, heathen fables relate how Mithras and Erecthonius were begotten of the soil in stone or earth by raging lust. Now, If anybody's familiar with the character of Recthonius from Greek mythology, it is obviously a figure that was born from the earth, but it was not in any way some kind of virgin conception. There's obviously a sexual aspect to that story. I'm not going to recount the tale, but if you're interested, you could find that. So the idea of a virgin birth isn't really supported by any of these things. What we end up having, also verified in iconography, is the birth of a young man, never a baby. There's no nativity scene. He springs basically naked from the rock. I apologize for the graphic nature of some of the depictions, but he's usually depicted carrying a torch and a dagger, representing the sun and the sacrifice of the bull that we're going to see in mythology. Now, I've seen plenty of nativity scenes, and I'm familiar with gold and frankincense and myrrh, but I have never seen a picture of baby Jesus with a blowtorch and a sword. So the parallel is a little bit exaggerated. Virgin birth, I think, is also further brought about by this connection with Zoroastrianism, which we already talked about. Because in Zoroastrianism, there is a savior figure known as Saoshyant, who is an eschatological figure, prophetic figure, that was virgin-born. You actually have three figures in the Zoroastrian tradition, Aushadar, Aushadharma, and Saoshyant, who are all virgin-born. They're all descendants of the prophet Zarathustra himself in an interesting scenario. In the Den card, it says this. I'm only going to read the first quote here. Then a maiden who is Shemingabu walks up to the water, she that is the mother of the famous Aushadar. Then she sits in the water and drinks it, and she kindles in a high degree those germs which were the third of the last of the righteous Zardasht was dropping forth originally. Though she was 15 years old, the girl has not before that associated with men, nor afterwards when she becomes pregnant has she done so before the time when she gives birth. So it's clearly a virgin birth scenario, and we say the same exact thing with Aushadharma and with Saoshyant himself. Okay? But what proof does this give us? Not much. Zoroastrianism, I don't think, impacted Mithraism. First of all, the text that we're looking at is a late Pahlavi text that dates to the 9th century A.D., much too late to impact Christian writings. The theology behind it dates to the Sasanian period of the 6th century A.D. So we're talking, again, 500 years after Christian texts were already written. As far as the reference to Saoshyant in the Gathas, which do predate Christianity, the reference to Saoshyant refers to Zarathustra and is in no way a virgin-born character. Okay, so there's no evidence of virgin birth at all. What about the death of Mithras? Well, comparisons, I think, between the death of Mithras and the death of Christ are misleading. There's absolutely no reference to the death of Mithras that can be found in Mithraic art or in any surviving literary references. So since Mithras is not a dying god, some people have actually tried to assume that the idea of a suffering savior somehow can extend to Mithras. And the fact that Mithras has this wonderful struggle with a bull, as if that's going to count as a comparison between the story of him and Jesus. So that, I think, stretches it. Of course, as far as the resurrection goes, if he doesn't have a death, it's hard to have a resurrection. And there's, again, no evidence of a resurrection for the god as well. The concept of rebirth is absent from early Mithraism. And the belief in the astrological ascent of the soul is something that was also added late to Mithraism. Now, here's the central story that we do know, and we have plenty of evidence for. It's called the Tauroctony. There are over 500 images of Mithras slaying the bull. All of them have the same basic elements. You've got the raven, the scorpion, the snake, the dog. Mithras astride the bull with a dagger, slaying the bull. Sometimes you have grain sprouting from its tail, sometimes from its wound. Okay, and the uniformity of the depiction basically shows that these all have really spiritual significance, which is why, all these images never vary much, except for maybe the head position of the god. So we can look at a number of illustrations, whether it's from freestanding sculpture, mosaics, frescoes, relief sculpture. They're the same all over the place. Now again, sort of against Cumont's hypothesis, this is not an Eastern motif. The iconography is purely Roman. Stylistically, there's no Near Eastern predecessors. Seems to be a Roman victory motif that's being copied here. And this particular one is from the Basilica Oppia of the Emperor Trajan, which is in the city of Rome itself, where you see a winged victory figure slaying a bull or getting ready to slay a bull. So again, that's more proof that what was going on in the cult is of Roman origin, not Eastern origin. Okay? That seems to be the central story. Now, scholars have not been able to identify where the story comes from. Okay? They've looked in pre-Mithraic traditions in the East to try to find a parallel. They've suggested several of them. Ahriman's slaughter of the primordial bull is probably the most commonly associated, but none of these parallels actually corresponds to what's going on in Mithraism. Ahriman, first of all, is their version of Satan within Zoroastrianism. So it has nothing to do with him being a salvific figure. And any of the other parallels that we find are either too general, simply a sacrifice of an animal for food or something like that, either too general or too late to have any impact on Mithraism. And besides that, Mithraism, Mithra is generally referred to as a protector of cattle in the earlier form, not a slayer of cattle. So he doesn't fit the Eastern prototype. Now, as far as the ritual similarity goes, Mithraism involved initiation, probably more initiations than any of the other mystery cults. It's a little bit like the Masonic tradition, where you've got levels of initiation. So the core acts would be where you start out. Hopefully you'll be initiated up to the level of pater at some part. But again, there's no clergy. Several different grades of initiation is all we get. As far as baptism and initiation goes, Tertullian, one of the church fathers, writes this. He says, the nations, who are strangers to all understanding of spiritual powers, ascribe to their idols the imbuing of waters with the self-same efficacy. So they do, but they cheat themselves with waters which are widowed, for washing is the channel through which they are initiated into some sacred rites of some notorious Isis or Mithras. The gods themselves, likewise, they honor by washings. So he does tell us that the initiates of Mithraism, as well as Isis initiates, were brought through some kind of water ceremony. Well, what does that prove? According to a classical scholar known as Walter Burkert, he is an authority on mystery religions. He actually says this. He says, there is as yet no philosophical historical proof that such passages as those found in the New Testament are directly derived from pagan mysteries, nor should they be used as the exclusive key to the procedures and ideology of the mysteries. It is appropriate to emphasize in this connection that there is hardly any evidence for baptism in pagan mysteries, though this has often been claimed. Of course, there are various forms of purification or sprinkling or washing with water, as in almost all other cults, but such procedures should not be confused with baptism proper, immersion into a river or basin as a symbol of starting a new life. So again, the whole idea that these washing ceremonies are universal in religion all over the world doesn't mean they mean the same thing as Christian baptism goes. Okay, so we don't need to posit some kind of copying from one of these cults for the idea of Christian baptism at all, and he doesn't believe we should. What about the Tarabolium? Okay, the New Testament does mention being washed in the blood of the Lamb. And we do know that there was a rite called the Tarabolium, which was a bull's blood baptism that actually occurred in Mithraism. It's sort of a late addition to Mithraism. Here you see an initiate underneath a grate where the bull is actually being sacrificed above him, and the blood would pour down on the initiate. Okay? Now this is a repeatable event in this particular tradition, but it again comes late to Mithraism, and it comes from another cult, which was the cult of Cybele, where we see the same thing originate, but not until around 160 A.D. So again, this is again well after any of the New Testament documents are written. So when they write, being washed in the blood, they weren't borrowing that phrase from the Mithraic cult. This whole idea is much too late to, again, influence the New Testament authors. Communion. What about the idea of a communal meal? Church fathers saw a parallel here. Justin Martyr, again, 2nd century, writes, he said, "This is my blood," referring to Jesus at the Last Supper, "and gave it to them alone, which the wicked devils have imitated in the mysteries of Mithras, commanding the same thing to be done. For that, bread and a cup of water are placed with certain incantations in the mystic rites of one who is being initiated. You either know or can learn." So here, not talking about bread and wine, but bread and water. Again, they obviously had some kind of sacrament. Or sorry, I shouldn't use the term sacrament. Some kind of ceremony that involved these things. In the Santa Prisca Mithraeum, which is in Rome, you have an inscription that reads, "Us too you have saved after having shed the eternal blood." The question is, does this evidence indicate an identical rite in symbolism and meaning that would require some kind of dependence? Did Christianity borrow it? There's really several problems. There's no evidence that the blood that was spoken of in this inscription belongs to Mithras. Most likely it's the bull's blood that's being talked about. Okay, not a slain savior, but a sacrificial animal. There's no evidence that the meal was sacramental in the sense that Christians view communion. There's no evidence that the communion meal was for all initiates. It was probably for certain initiates at certain levels. And there's no evidence that the eating of the bull's flesh and blood brought some kind of spiritual salvation. So those are all just leaps. And one of the big problems with most theories is that anytime we start using Christian terminology and a Christian understanding when we look at these older cults, we end up sort of by accident reading understandings back into these things. So because we decided we're going to call it a communion, it brings certain mental baggage with it. And we shouldn't assume that it's the same thing as Christian communion just because we're using these terms. That's a big mistake that we often make. And again, eating this sacrificial victim is commonplace to all animal sacrifice throughout the world, especially the Greco-Roman world. You don't just sacrifice an animal and burn it. You sacrifice an animal, burn parts, and eat the rest. So that's normal in the context of the pagan religion. What about Christmas? We talked about the idea of December 25th being the birth of Mithras, long before it became the birth of Jesus. And I'm not going to argue against that. I don't think there's a problem here. It's just irrelevant to the conclusion that the New Testament somehow borrowed from Mithraism, because the narrative of Christ's birth dates back to the 1st century, where December 25th being recognized as the birthday of the god Mithras doesn't show up until the 3rd century, during the time of Aurelian, when the soul cult became officially recognized by Rome. Okay, so we don't have that early enough to impact the New Testament. And of course, the New Testament doesn't mention anything about December 25th. The fact that we celebrate December 25th as the birth of Jesus has nothing to do with Scripture. The earliest references we have to December 25th come in the 4th century during the time of Constantine, okay, who also was a devotee of Sol Invictus early before he became a Christian. The West eventually did settle on the date of December 25th, though there was a lot of debate in the early church. And it seems to show us a victory of Christianity over pagan worship, not the adoption of pagan worship, but the replacement of pagan worship. And there's no way that this impacts anything in Christian theology. So again, the date is irrelevant to accusations. As far as Sunday worship goes, again, a lot of people blame Constantine for moving the day of worship from the Jewish Sabbath to the day of the sun. But I think that's a little bit of an overstatement. We do again know that he was an initiate. But I don't think he moved the date, and there are a few reasons for this. First of all, even if the day did move, it has nothing again to do with the New Testament, borrowing from Mithraism. We do see passages in the New Testament that indicate that the first day of the week is a special day, basically because Jesus rose from the dead on the first day of the week. And as far as the early 2nd century church goes, Justin Martyr affirms that Christians, were meeting on the day of the sun, on the Sunday, first day of the week. Much earlier. This is several centuries before Constantine. Now, I didn't say they were only meeting on the day of the sun. A lot of people believe they met on the Sabbath and on the Sunday, twice a week. But by the time you get to Constantine, all he didn't make an official day, but he simply declared it a day of rest so as not to disturb the Christians that were already doing this. They were already meeting on this day. So they didn't borrow it from Mithraism, but they got it from the idea of the resurrection on the first day. Let's finish up with this little part. Like I said, we don't need to posit some kind of borrowing from Mithraism to understand where the ideas of Christianity come from. Christianity is best understood in light of 1st century Judaism, the Second Temple period Judaism. Unlike Mithras, we have a figure of Jesus who is a historical figure, whose life is well documented. Every key element in his story is actually foreshadowed in the Hebrew Scriptures. He was a Jewish rabbi. He had Jewish followers. The initiation of the Lord's Supper is best understood in the context of the Jewish Passover meal, not the Mithraic communion. The sacrificial aspect of his death is likewise best understood in light of temple sacrifice, Old Testament images, substitutionary atonement, and especially the Passover lamb, not the Mithraic slaying of a bull. The immersion baptism that's found in the New Testament finds its roots in Jewish practice, the practice of baptizing proselytes, and even in sects like the Essenes, who used ritual bathing regularly. Okay, so I don't think we need to look for Mithraism as a source of Christianity. Christianity is purely rooted in Judaism and in the revelation that God gave to the Hebrew people. If you're interested more on this particular topic, I do have a little bibliography for suggested reading. Walter Burkert's book on ancient mystery cults is highly recommended. He is not writing from a Christian point of view. He's a purely objective scholar, and a lot of the stuff he writes is very helpful to the Christian position. I have an article that's published in the Christian Apologetics Journal back in 2007, where I cover most of the same things I talked about in this particular talk, in not quite as much depth. It's a short article. William Malandra, expert in Iranian religion, if you're interested in more in the Zoroastrian tradition and stuff that was going on in Persia, good source there. Can't recommend Ronald Nash highly enough. The Gospel in the Greeks is probably one of the best books on dealing with Christianity and mystery religions in general, and all kinds of accusations of Christian borrowing from the Greco-Roman world. And then one of my favorite scholars, Edmund Yamauchi, who wrote a book called Persia and the Bible, where he deals with the issue of Mithraism at one point. In maybe a few pages he deals with it. But again, a good Christian scholar, but again, writing as a scholar and not just a Christian. So that's pretty much the entire presentation. Hopefully you got something out of it. I know I talked very quickly, but hopefully you at least gathered something. Thank you.